These performances have nothing to do with yogic pursuits for attaining spiritual awareness. They've got nothing to do with shamanistic displays of human prowess. They've got nothing to do with pseudo-scientific, medical and methodical research. Rather, these are artistic strategies providing alternate aesthetic possibilities. The penetration extrapolation event was one of the early physically difficult performances where the body ran through a sheet of glass. What was interesting was remembering hitting the plate of glass. It was as if everything sort of slowed down. Your body was sort of moving through the air. The glass was breaking away from it. You even had time to think you should be careful when you landed not to stand on any of these bits of glass that were shattering all over the place. And all of a sudden you landed and things kind of splintered up again. That was in Mexico City at the University Museum in 1976. With the rock suspension, the body's weight is counterbalanced by the ring of rocks, one rock for each insertion point. The ring of rocks was already suspended with slip knots above. When all the insertions had been done and the cables were connected, the body quickly tugged at each cable, the slip knots were released, the rocks came down, the body came up and kind of balanced out. In fact, it wasn't a static suspension. The body was gently swaying from side to side, setting up random oscillations in the rocks. Although most of the performances involving suspensions were static, some involved movement. The one in Los Angeles at Espace DBD involved the body actually being controlled and contorted by 8 separate people. These 8 people could modify the body positioned in space. An arm could be lifted up, a leg allowed to lower down, the back hoisted higher. The stretched skin landscape changed as different people pulled and allowed the body to drop. When I decided to insert the body in a city space, when the decision was made to suspend the body between 2 buildings over a street, then obviously performing in a public space had special problems, like affecting people, the probability of police intervention, and so all these things were taken into account in the East Village event in 1984. I'd done a performance in Los Angeles 2 weeks previously, suspended horizontally face up. Because this New York event was only 2 weeks later, it necessitated being suspended horizontally face down. All the preparations were done in the 4th floor room, pretty much in privacy. The cable actually came out of the 4th floor window. So when everything was ready, the body was connected to a pulley type structure, a kind of flying fox arrangement, and slid along the cable through the window and stopped about halfway across the street. We were hoping that it was going to be about a half an hour performance, but of course within a few minutes police cars had arrived, sirens wailing, people were sort of shouting from down below. Some drug dealers on the corner who didn't like the attention their neighbourhood was receiving started throwing some nuts and bolts at me. The only other public performance in a city was in Copenhagen, but in comparison to the New York performance, the police assisted. And you know, there were about 10,000 people watching. We didn't really announce the performance in New York, but the art community, the word got around within the art community, whereas there was a fairly big public presence in the event in Denmark. After I did the first suspension, I really didn't think that I'd do any more. In fact, I did 26 after that. The first 3 or 4 involved simply rotating the body in space, then positioning the body in different situations, in different locations, inside galleries, in remote external environments. I guess these performances were between the primal yearnings of floating and flying and about the contemporary reality of the astronaut in zero-G. People imagine that there's some special technique or trick, or that we use anesthetic. There's really no special preparation. You think about the performance over several months. You try to conceptually imagine and visually insert your body into that location and foresee any problems. But there's a point in time where the thinking has to stop and the action begins. There's a kind of collapse that occurs between intention and action. There's a point where the physical consequences become a reality. You're no longer looking at them or expecting them to happen, but rather the intention to do something collapses into the action of the physical experience. Even at art school, I disliked learning techniques or skills. I always thought that this was an impediment to creative working. I didn't really want to be a craftsperson, just a maker of aesthetic objects. I was always suspicious of the conditioning that technique often imposes, so I stayed away from that until it was really necessary to do, until I had to make the third hand. The event for Wind and Waves was in fact a suspension on an outcrop of rocks about 300 metres from shore. The body was suspended side on, looking towards the horizon. Its perception sort of slid between the serenity of the distant horizon to the kind of crashing of the waves below it. The whole structure sort of creaked and swayed. We had begun suspending the body early morning, but because of the difficulty of keeping the structure wedged between the rocks, by the time we were ready, the tide had come in. There was quite a stiff and blustery breeze blowing, and it was so threatening that we had to do the insertions on shore and then actually wade out. It was probably the longest of the suspensions, because I was probably suspended about 20 minutes in isolation, but it probably took 20 minutes for the assistants to go back to shore, and about 20 minutes for them to come back and cut me down. We were very fortunate because this was next to the Museum of Contemporary Art. The Museum of Contemporary Art was a pretty uninteresting space, and sort of it was a white carpeted space, and weren't so interested in doing a performance in that environment. And fortunately, there was a factory next door that had just recently been vacated. And when I looked inside to see, whether it'd be a suitable suspension space, we found this, this gantry crane with its control box and all, and so I could sort of control the body up and down, move along, move backwards, sideways. So again, it was this idea of choreographing the body's motions in the space. For me, it was this relationship between this machine and the body. People tend to focus on the body itself, but it is this choreography between the machine and the body. And no one was told what was going to happen. Most people thought it was just going to be an up and down job. Well, I only expected to do one suspension event, but having sort of achieved one, I guess the next couple had to do with, the physical challenge of doing another one in a different position. But I guess after the first half a dozen, It wasn't any more the physical challenge I'd shown that it was possible to do, but rather the different conceptual and sculptural possibilities that these suspension events generated. Between 1970 and 1975, I'd done a series of suspension events with ropes and harnesses, and those suspension events were also fully amplified. So brain waves, heartbeat, blood flow, muscle signals were indicative of the body's condition during these suspensions, during these performances. So the notion of amplifying the body begins around 1970. The last performance event involving suspending the body was at an abandoned monorail station in Ofuna in Japan. In this case, the body was suspended with third hand attached, amplified body signals and sounds from an abandoned monorail structure. The body had a control box which enabled it to actuate the motor and pull and lower the body up and down. This performance was about 30 minutes, whilst the suspended body controlled the motions of its three hands. It sort of choreographed and composed the amplified body signals and sounds. Having done these series of sensory deprivation events determining the physical and psychological limitations of the body, having done these series of 27 suspension events which really push the body beyond its normal boundaries, there was an interest now not only in the normal physiological boundaries, but rather extending and enhancing the body using technology. Looking at the various things that were going on, I became interested in artificial hands, and did a little bit of work in Germany where I sort of looked at the three-fingered Otto Bock hand. I was more interested in the five-fingered approach that was happening in Japan, and visited Professor Kato's laboratory at Waseda University, visited Tokyo Institute of Technology, and got an overview of what was going on with robotics and prosthetics, and so that's how the Third Hand project began. And having failed in my application to the Australia Council for funding, it then took me 4 years and about $10,000 of my own money to finish the hand. Although initially the third hand was just a visual attachment to the body, having made a third hand, there was the temptation to do other things with it. And even though I'm not ambidextrous, the idea of drawing or writing with three hands simultaneously seemed to be a difficult but a challenging performance. So I did a series of these where the three hands, for example, drew a circle, a square and a triangle. Finally, the three hands were able to write a single word, the word evolution. I actually learnt to write two words, evolution and decadence, and these were both 9-letter words. But because of the spacing of the three hands, it wasn't simply a matter of sequentially writing the letters. One had to write every third letter. So the first three letters of evolution were E, L and I, V, U and O. You had to move your three hands across and write every third letter. The problem then was not simply one of physically controlling the third hand, but rather of remembering which letters you were writing. Initially, I imagined the third hand as an electronic device that could be symbiotically connected to the body on a semi-permanent basis. I mean, I always imagined that I could wear this extra limb continuously during the day, every day, just as one would wear one's clothes. One could attach this third hand, this extra limb, to your body. The reality of it was, though, that although it only weighs a couple of kilos, it's still a significant weight to have on your body all day long. And then with the skin irritation from the electrode gel, well, it just wasn't comfortable to have it connected all the time. So the third hand became more a performance element rather than a semi-permanent attachment. It was initially, I guess, just a visual attachment to the body. I was happy to have just an extra limb for the performances. And although it didn't have individual finger movements, it had a pinch, a grasp, a 300-degree wrist rotation clockwise and anti-clockwise, and the tactile feedback system allowed for a rudimentary sense of touch. So it was then, and still very much is, a sophisticated state-of-the-art robotic device. When I first began using the hand, the operation was pretty much done in a very sequential way. I would think I wanted the mechanical hand to move. I'd transfer my attention to the appropriate muscle side, which would be either the abdominal or leg muscles. Then I'd contract that muscle, and eventually the third hand would move. Now it's much more instantaneous, much more intuitive. I don't have to think in this sequential way. The performance and the operation of the third hand is a much more interactive and much more immediate process. Well, the use of video initially was because of the sort of notion of a video shadow, of sort of replicating what was happening physically and then being able to manipulate it in some way. But the first major performance I did with a large video screen was in Japan for the Sony Jumbotron screen, and that was like about 40 meters long, 25 meters high. It was a huge structure, and it was sort of visible a kilometre away in daylight. In effect, the large TV screen was a sophisticated TV studio, and for that performance, through visual gestures, I sort of choreographed what the screen was doing. You know, I wasn't hardwired in any way, but certain gestures indicated freezing the image or splitting the screen or superimposing. So that was really the first major performance that I felt video played a part in. It was like inserting the body into this sort of huge landscape of video. And of course, you know, you could manipulate the sort of temporal and spatial flow. And from then on, I've never been able to get access to such a large screen as the Sony one for the Scuba Science exhibition, but I have been using projection and becoming the video switcher, using mercury switches on the limbs or the head. I'm able to kind of switch and mix images live as part of the performance. The performance in Linz included an interactive video system, this time with the screen above the body and the small robot, and as well as the 3 cameras positioned around and external to the body. I had swallowed live a 1 metre 20 centimetre endoscope, providing live internal images of the stomach itself. So through gestures I could switch from external views of the body to a live internal view of the stomach. If anyone's had an endoscopic probe, you'll realise how uncomfortable that is. But we couldn't get direct medical assistance. We had someone advising us, but for ethical and other reasons, they wouldn't help us during the performance. So there was no spraying of the throat with local anaesthetic. I had to guide this endoscope into my stomach. I was pretty hungry on the day because I couldn't eat for 6 hours before. But fortunately, even without medical assistance, I was able to insert the endoscope. It went down smoothly and it stayed down for 20 minutes. The experience of the hollow body is not merely a conceptual one for me, or a particular strategy with synthetic skin. Every time I amplify my internal body rhythms, I'm externalizing these functions out of this particular humanoid shape. The cuboid space of the room becomes the new container of body rhythms and body functions, right? So the notion of the hollow body is a performance experience as well as a conceptual strategy to alter our anatomy. The ideas that the performances have generated are speculations. They're not ideologies that drive the performances, that fashion the events. These ideas shouldn't be seen as a justification for the events. Certainly, as these ideas were realised, they do have a feedback looping effect, and they do resonate in the performances. I mean, I can't avoid that happening. But I don't sit there thinking, well, how can I express the notion of an obsolete body? How will I show that I can redesign the body? I mean, these ideas have come from doing the performances as aesthetic experiences, and if they generate these speculations, if they present alternate possibilities, then that's fine. All of the ideas that we've talked about have certainly come from my performances, have certainly come from the experiences that this particular body has, but they're not about this particular body. In fact, there's a general misconception that somehow performance art is about the body, and furthermore that performance art is about a particular body, the body that is actually making the actions. And I would query both of those assumptions. My concern was always, I guess, a kind of an evolutionary interest on how human beings develop, how by constructing artifacts, instruments, computers, spacecraft, how these technologies impact on our perception of the world. In fact, what makes us human is our technologies. Technology isn't an alien artifact, and technology is constantly reconstructing what we call human nature. We would like to believe human nature is this sort of constant, spiritual, absolute entity, but in fact what it means to be human is constantly being constructed. These are some of the performances using the large robot, and in fact this was the first performance with the robot in London, and in this case the robot has a camera at the end of the arm. There are cameras above and around the body, and through sensors on the arms the body controls the visual images, choreographs and composes the visual images live through its gestures as part of the performance. So this strong arm is a species of kind of hydraulic lifting arms. Interestingly enough, it's not on wheels or anything, which you'd think that it might be useful if it was, but it's basically something that's sort of fixed on the spot, and you can basically maneuver the arm around, and at the end of the arm you can attach various sorts of claws or manipulators, and you can effortlessly sort of glide the thing towards a heavy weight. It can grab it, and then you lift and it does all the work for you, although it's not a pre-programmed thing. It's something that you guide, So basically here what's happening is that I'm guiding the robot around. It's supporting a lot of my weight, but at the same time its jointed mechanism is determining to a great extent what I can do. And the fact that we could sort of strap the medical instruments on it meant that, again, even though I was hardwired to the medical stuff, that travelled around with me. It's a very, very interesting device.
I no longer consider the body in a Platonic or Cartesian way. I mean, I don't see the body as a physical body driven by some, Platonic spirit inside of it. I don't think it's necessary to make a distinction between mind and matter as Descartes does. So the body is this physical system. Not only now do I not think I have a spirit, but I also don't any longer think I have a mind in the way that, I possess an ego or a self. In fact, notions of self and ego are social constructs. My intelligence is manifested not in my mind, but rather in the medium of language between you and me. There's nothing in my head. There's absolutely nothing. There are no images. There are no thoughts. My thoughts are only occurring through this process of speaking, through this process of exchanging language with another body. Psychologically, what's important is not what's in there. There's no fuzzy psyche inside your head. There are no images inside of your head. Your head is empty. What's really happening is intelligence and mind manifested in language between people. So it's no longer meaningful to talk about mind and body. The philosophical problem of knowing other minds sort of evaporates if minds don't exist in other people, but rather are manifested between us in our behaviour, in our speech, in our actions. New experiences for me are reinforced with teleoperation systems, where, for example, if the human operator and remote robot are connected together with sufficiently high amounts of feedback loops, both in quantity and quality. If these feedback loops between the remote robot and the human operator are good enough, then what happens is that there's a psychological and spatial collapse between the operator and the robot. You see what the robot sees. You hear what the robot hears. The robot does what you do. Effectively, you become one operational system. Intelligence then resides in the system. This robot is effectively a part of your body, an appendage of your body, because this body acts for you as if it was you, then again the distinction between mind and body or robot and body totally disappears. You realise, hey, the intelligence is in the system, it's in the interconnections. We have to realise that the kind of the illusion of self, the illusion of mind, is both an evolutionary and social construct. But when we examine this notion more carefully, it does become a fictive, rhetorical, metaphorical thing, not an object that has any reality in itself.
Well, the use of video initially was because of the sort of notion of a video shadow, of sort of replicating what was happening physically and then being able to manipulate it in some way. But of course, in recent performances with VR systems, then of course the only way you can image to an audience a virtual arm or a virtual body is through a video screen. And of course virtual reality is this hybridization of new sensor, video and computer technologies, and that's what really makes a virtual system. Well, it actually began in 1992. The idea initially was to make a virtual arm that could be controlled by a pair of data gloves, the right glove being the mimicking glove, so anything my right hand did, my virtual arm did, and the left glove was for the gesture recognition command language. So this virtual arm could have extended capabilities like grafting extra hands on the arm, or stretching, or continuous wrist rotation as well as continuous finger rotation. So this idea of a computer-generated arm that could be interactively controlled and given extended capabilities, I thought would develop into a very powerful performance tool.
When I had the opportunity to use a VR system at the RMIT Advanced Computer Graphics Centre, the notion of being immersed in cyberspace or experiencing a high fidelity illusion of interactive connectedness with the software, I mean, these sorts of things were not particularly interesting for me. I became interested in the idea of a virtual arm in studying phantom limb sensations. When a person loses their limb, their hand, their arm, they still have a sensation of a phantom hand. They can still kind of feel it. And initially it was thought that perhaps it was just simply the nerve endings of the stump of the arm that still provided some of the sensory information. In recent years, though, the explanations have become more interesting as to why one has a phantom limb sensation, and in fact now it's believed that the cluster of neuronal cells that ordinarily were processing the signals from the hand don't simply lose their function altogether, but seemingly reconnect with neighbouring cells. So for example, if you scratch your face, you can feel a virtual hand or a phantom hand. So this was kind of the reverse thing. I'm experiencing the sensation of an additional virtual limb. One experience I have to relate about this was I gave a talk at Aix-en-Provence on a seminar on animal, human and machine locomotion and communication, and at the end of the talk a couple of girls came up to speak to me. After a few minutes I noticed that one of the girls in fact had an artificial arm. I did not realise this when I was talking to her, and I sort of remarked how interesting and how delicately made her artificial arm was. And she said, well, I was very interested in your talk, and I have some extra arms because one is already, one's being repaired, the other one's always being, damaged either by touching something that's hot or, so one is always being replaced. And she said, would you like one of my artificial arms? Because I have a few extra ones. And I said, well, yes, I would like one of your arms. And without any hesitation, she screwed off her artificial arm and handed it to me. And I was standing there with this arm, holding this arm, and for the first time, and I mean I've been using prosthetics and robotics for a long time, but for the first time, I thought, well, what is this? This is a part of this person, and I'm holding a part of the person. And I thought this was a very strange feeling because all this time, I assumed that this arm was a part of this body, and all of a sudden it's disconnected and I'm holding it, and I'm standing here with 4 arms, and this girl's walking away with 1 arm, which was very disconcerting, so I quickly called her back. But then I thought, well, what constitutes identity? I mean, when do you start feeling alien to yourself? I mean, if you could replace your limbs with artificial parts that would have the same function, if you can replace the torso, if you could replace your neck, if you could peel away your skin and replace your skin, if these artificial parts had similar functions, what would constitute your identity? At what point would you say, this is not my body, this is not me? Figure that you saw just a moment ago was a virtual computer-generated body. I was controlling it with 8 polymer sensors on the arms, head, back and legs. And as well as controlling the limb motion, we had mapped virtual camera views on the motion sensors. So for example, when I lift my arm, not only does the virtual arm lift, but you get a different view of the virtual body. The virtual body was in 2 visual modes, a wireframe and construction point mode, which you just saw, and a visual mode with deformable skin. By swinging my right arm, I could get the virtual camera to move around the virtual body, constituting a rotation of the virtual body. Of course, the body is watching what's happening on a small TV monitor and trying to compose the image on the screen.
Images are no longer these detached, illusory sort of phenomena, but images can now become interactive with the body. The body can capture an image. and can control that image. Images now are becoming more seductive because they're more immersive and they're more interactive. And of course, technology is a much better life support system for our images now than for our physical bodies. So I find that intriguing, you know, that the body is or technology is transducer from a physical to a phantom body. So I got very excited about the idea of choreographing the motions of a virtual body, and because a lot of these performances are in fact about different sorts of movements. I mean, from the third hand motions triggered by muscle and muscle signals from the abdominal and leg muscles, to involuntary arm movements controlled by muscle stimulation, to the sort of the precision and speed of an industrial robot arm. Here was another sort of movement, a physical transduced to a virtual movement.
I don't see the performance in any sort of gendered sense, for example. I mean, it's not important in fact, it's not important that it's this particular body, you know. So the performances are not about my own kind of personal melodramatic psychodrama in my head, but rather of a body, of a human body plugged into a technological system. It's just a human body as an evolutionary structure. One has to remember that the reason we are human and what distinguishes us from most other living creatures is the fact that we make artifacts. We make tools and instruments, we make computers. The fact that we can sense in spectrums beyond the visible, the fact that we can now move much faster than the speed of sound, the fact that technology speeds up the body and the body now leaves the earth altogether. These are things that technology makes possible. The idea of machines inside the body totally changes the dynamic and the relationship and the symbiosis between human and technology. Whereas once symbiosis depended on the substance of technology, whether that technology was biocompatible, now it's only scale. If these machines are spec-sized, we can safely swallow them. And imagine the new realm of machines will be the internal soft tissue and hollow tracks. So this is rather a totally unexpected new dynamic and direction of technology. A lot of technology in the future will be invisible. It'll be invisible because it'll be inside the body.
Well, we proved it was both physiologically and medically awkward to do, very, very physically difficult to do for me. The problem really was that you had two tubes stuck down your throat. We first had to insert the stomach sculpture, which was actuated by a drive cable to a servo motor and a logic circuit outside the body. The diameter of that flexi drive cable was about 8 millimeters, and then you've got a 10 to 12 millimeter endoscope that has to be inserted after that. The doctor really didn't want to risk trying to image the sculpture opened inside the stomach, because I imagined that the sculpture would be within the stomach cavity, but in fact what was happening was that the endoscope was pushing it against the stomach wall, hard up against the stomach wall. So there were real problems there. Yeah, I have to say that I found the stomach sculpture project the most difficult one to realise up till now. It was extremely difficult, sort of psychologically and physically, to do, to insert this this capsule about the size of your thumb and which opened up to about the size of your fist, to insert it into the stomach, to try to image it with the endoscope. I mean, physiologically it's very difficult to take, even though we had to have the throat sprayed with local anaesthetic. It was still fairly painful. You feel constantly sick, you want to throw up. I must admit, after the second attempt, when we used the video endoscopy, I got home and It just felt as if my body had been sort of pretty traumatized. I broke into a cold sweat, and I was feeling really queasy. Had to get medical attention. In fact, had to go to the clinic and get a shot, and I was under observation for about 3 hours before they let me go. I think my body was in kind of shock, you know. It was a pretty traumatic thing to do. It's just not an easy procedure. The new stomach sculpture, this new internal body structure, will be 7 independent modular electronic capsules. These will be inserted individually into the stomach. When everything is down there using endoscopic instruments, it'll be possible to assemble this structure, magnetically couple the components into a freestanding, self-powered object.
I guess in the end, we've been concentrating in the past on prodding and poking our psyches. The body has been this kind of absolute thing, and we've tried to study what we consider is mind, what we consider is spirit. But in fact, there's nothing there. There's nothing, you know. It's empty. The body's empty. There's no images in my head. There's only chemistry. There are no memories in my body. There are no memories. Memories may be elicited in my behaviour and in my physiological kind of neuronal firings when I receive an external stimulus that might synchronise with something that's already there, that's already chemically changed in the synapse. But my head is not a repository for images. I will never have information overload. A computer might, but a body won't.
We mostly operate as absent bodies. That's because the body is designed to interface with its environment. Its senses are open to the world. The body's mobility and navigation in the world require this outward orientation. And this absence is augmented by the fact that the body functions habitually and automatically. People operate merely as minds immersed in metaphysical fogs. Imagine a virtual body that is imbued with an artificial intelligence that makes it increasingly autonomous. Such an intelligent and autonomous phantom entity would become an operational agent for the body. Images are no longer these benign entities that are simply hung on the wall or transmitted in the media. Images now become more viral, more active, intelligent, autonomous, capable of operating with other virtual entities. In fact, the realm of the post-human may no longer merely reside in the realm of the cyborg, but rather in the realm of intelligent, autonomous, and operational images. For the last 8 or 9 years, I've been interested in using involuntary body movement. We've now developed a touchscreen interface for a multiple muscle stimulation, which allows not only the programming of the arm, but most of the body's actions. The orange flesh indicates the stimulation areas, and the red flesh the actuated muscle site. We can program the body in 2 ways, either by touching the muscle site, producing the appropriate behavior with the stimulation, as well as simulating the motion. It also sends serial port signals to the multiple muscle stimulator, which then sends 0 to 60 volts to the body. The computer choreography then translates into physical motion. There's also an improvised function which allows a superimposition of random movements with varying velocities to be superimposed upon the actuated muscle movements. And then we can also choreograph the body's movements by pasting from a library of gesture icons and producing a sequence of motions that we can then play. We'll have the improvise button on, and the frame indicates the sequence of motions that are being activated at any one time. There's also a pause function where the motion can be examined before being again sent to the body. So this becomes in fact the seductive interface for remotely activating the body. Now simplistically, this is a kind of remote control process, but at a different conceptual level. The movement that I make in Melbourne happens in someone else's body in London. In other words, we're displacing a physical movement from one body to another body in another place. We now remotely activate robots, but there would be an advantage in some situations, and if the body is not in a hazardous location, to borrow a human arm rather than a robot manipulator, because that human arm would be connected to another arm and a mobile intelligent body. So you could perform a collaborative action where a part of your body completes the task initiated remotely. So with this system, it would be possible to distribute intelligence and agency. It would be a kind of recursive fractal flesh where agency could be manifested in other bodies, in other bits of bodies, in other places. Imagine a body that can perform an action without memory, a body that can make a motion without knowing that it will carry it out, an action without any expectation. Consider a body driven by multiple agents, remotely situated and spatially separated. A problem no longer of having a split personality, but rather a split physicality. If you were watching this body's movements in London, what you would be seeing would be the manifestation of a remote, spatially separated body. In other words, the body becomes a host for another agent. Electronically coupled bodies could then extrude agency from one body to another body in another place. Your awareness would neither be all here nor all there. Excellent.